Hello everybody, I am here today with the lovely Gayle Hulme, who runs British Sovereigns and Royals, and I know a few of you are in that group on Facebook. And we are here today as part of Alternative August, which, if anyone hasn't come across this before and thinking, well, this is a Tudor thing, we are just looking at some other areas of history today to sort of see if we can pique people's interest and sort of look at some different things, because nothing occurs in isolation. And we have to understand everything in context of what's happened before and in the future. So we are here today to talk about Queen Victoria, and everyone in the world, I think, must have heard of Queen Victoria. She's a huge, sort of towering figure in our royal history, isn't she? And she was the longest serving queen until our current monarch, Queen Elizabeth, took her over a few years ago. But I think having 63 years on the throne was even more remarkable because of the age she lived to at that time, you know, living her life in the 19th century. You know, that her life expectancy then wasn't so great. So it was a massive achievement, whichever way you look at it. So we're here today to learn about Victoria, because Gayle is a bit of an expert on Victoria and her husband, Albert. You are. I'll just pile on some pressure now. But before we get on to talking about Victoria, please can you tell us a little bit about you and what you do, and about British Sovereigns and Royals?
So thank you very much, Catherine, for inviting me on today to have a chat about Queen Victoria. My interest in British Royals started a long time ago, and I decided to set up the British Sovereigns and Royals page because I was really interested in British Royals, but I couldn't find everything that I wanted in the one place. So my interest started from like 1066 onwards into, you know, the modern royals that we know and love today. And I wanted to put it all in one place. So I decided I had this little brainwave that I would set up a little group, wondering, you know, if anybody out there in the world would have the same interest as me. And that was about 3 years ago now, and it's kind of grown arms and legs.
Oh goodness, I didn't realise it was
yeah, no, it's not long. And with the aids of the guys who run the page and do the admin, it's really brilliant. And you know, we have lots of contributors. I like to, you know, kind of go to royal venues and look around and take videos and stuff like that. It's like not been as much as we wanted to in the past while because of circumstances. But yeah. So yeah, the British Sovereigns and Royal page it's been a great experience, and it's allowed me avenue to stop boring my family.
I think we all have to find one of those, haven't we, over time? They kind of nod. David's great. David's my other half. People don't know. He quite likes going to places. You know, he's quite up for it. But you can kind of, if I start going, oh, you can see him going, that's great.
Yeah.
Gonna go
tea time yet.
Yeah, pretty much. So yeah, he's my kids are just like, so that's a no-go at the minute.
Yeah.
So we'll start, obviously we're going pretty much chronologically here, but I think Victoria was born and she was very young. So was she born in 1801? Have I got that right?
Victoria was born in 1819.
Okay, no, she died in 1901, didn't she? That's
yes. She was actually one of the kind of products of the royal baby race. So after Princess Charlotte died in childbirth, she was the heir to George the Fourth. After she died in childbirth, there were no heirs to the throne, basically. So all of George's brothers decided that they would have to kind of ditch their mistresses and get a wife who could produce children. Victoria's mother was a widow and already had 2 young children in Germany. So the Duke of Kent married Victoria. She was called Victoria as well. And they rushed Victoria when she was pregnant over to Great Britain, over to the UK, because they wanted this baby to be born in the UK. They didn't want this baby to be born in Germany. So Victoria was born on 24th of May 1819 in Kensington Palace. And if you actually ever get to visit Kensington Palace, You can actually
Was
go
on
into the
my
room.
list this year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can actually go into the room where she was born, and there's a little brass plaque in the corner that says, you know, Queen Victoria was born in this room. So, an interesting fact about Queen Victoria was she was actually delivered by a female doctor who was
Oh.
also a midwife, which was unheard of at the time.
Yeah.
And it was the same midwife doctor who delivered Prince Albert in Germany in August, a few months after Victoria's birth. So they were actually delivered by the same woman.
Wow. And that's sort of a good sort of a coincidence, but also, as you say, the fact that it was a female doctor rather than just somebody in a midwife role, which I suppose shows that it took a while, but things were finally moving.
Finally moving, yeah. And this was part of the problem in Princess Charlotte's death, in that it wasn't a midwife that attended her, it was 3 male doctors who really weren't that experienced. They kind of knew at one point that the baby hadn't survived, and she had been in labour for a long time, that the baby hadn't survived. And if they had delivered the baby with forceps at that point, then Charlotte's life might have been saved. But because they were all kind of like, oh, you know, if we mess this up, this is potentially like treason.
Yeah.
If there's something wrong here, they just left her to her own devices, and then the baby was born dead, and then a few hours later she died herself, because she said that they had made her tipsy. That's what she said to Baron Stockmar, who was there. She said, Baron, they have made me tipsy. And they kept bleeding her as well, and they wouldn't give her anything to eat, and she was exhausted. So it was a good thing that Princess Louise, who was Albert's father, and Victoria weren't attended by the royal doctors.
The doctors were supposed to be the best, obviously, but that doesn't always equate to the right knowledge, does it?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
So, she was the niece of the current monarch at the time, wasn't she? William IV, I think.
William IV, yeah. He didn't want to be, he wasn't really cut out to be king. He was kind of like very kind of outspoken and talkative, and he had, I think he had 12 children by his mistress.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, Mrs. Dorothy. Oh, goodness. No, I'll try. Her name will come back to me. But he had 12 children to her. So poor Adelaide, Queen Adelaide, when she married him, was kind of, he was the Duke of Cambridge then. He was stuck with all, Duke of Clarence rather, stuck with all of these.
Oh God.
Illegitimate children.
About, is it?
You know, and it's such a shame as well, because Adelaide did have 2 daughters, and neither of her children survived.
Oh.
And yet William IV had all of these children to women, this actress, you know, who survived to adulthood, but the 2 children that were legitimate both died, which was a real shame for Adelaide.
So it was known from quite a young age that she was going to be queen. So there's 2 things to me now that shaped what was to come during her sort of later child and then into her adolescence. So the first was, people knew that she was going to be queen, and there were people prepared to exploit that.
Yeah.
And the second is that she lost her father at the age of 8 months.
Yeah.
So she felt, and you look at her behaviours and her future relationships, and I don't just mean like intimate, relationships, like friendships and bonds and things. She seems to be always looking for that, or somebody that she can depend on. It was like she felt that she didn't have anybody to depend on in that time, because speaking of people stepping into sort of fatherhood type roles and taking advantage of her mother was very much sort of left. When she became a widow, she was broke. People didn't really like her, did they? But King William allowed her to sort of stay around and live there, to be supported to an extent. But she met a charming, by charming, I mean cretinous man called John Conroy.
Yeah, John Conroy, the pantomime villain. John Conroy wasn't unknown to the Duke of Kent. He was, I think they were in the army together, and he was very studious about serving the Duke of Kent. And, you know, it was yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full, sir. And the Duke of Kent didn't sign any orders that that John Conroy should have any kind of right or say so over Victoria and little baby Gina, as she was at the time. And so that knocked him. That kind of like he wanted that say so, he wanted that official say so. But also the problem with John Conroy was his grandson, who is an Oxford Don, released some family diaries in the 90s, and they allude to the fact that John Conroy actually believed that his own wife was the daughter of the Duke of Kent. So it's not true, because the Duke of Kent was actually in Gibraltar when when John Conroy's wife Elizabeth was baptised in Canada, and so the conception could never have happened. But he strongly believed and had this sense of entitlement that had there been a marriage certificate and a legitimate birth, it would be his wife who would be heir to the throne, and by association he would be the prince consort.
He was very grandiose in his ideas, wasn't he?
Yeah. And he did believe that was the thing. I think he did believe, when we come to like the Kensington rules and this business about, not being allowed to associate at the royal court, because George IV and his brothers were seen as they were debt ridden, they were, debauched, they were reprobates, there was drunkenness, gluttony, there was madness. Obviously, it's not madness, we would say it would be depression now on the part of our grandfather. So they were at pains to separate from Victoria from all of that.
Yeah.
Plus, they believed that the Duke of Cumberland would, given the chance, actually do her physical harm because he was next in line. So he believed he was doing the right thing, although it was very oppressive for the child.
Yeah. So she was living at Kensington Palace, and it appears in hindsight that when she was a small child, she actually had quite a loving relationship with her mother, even though that's not how she remembered it. But it may very well be that she did, but sort of Conroy stepped in, and as you say, he was very oppressive, wasn't he?
Yeah.
And they devised something, and you could say, they were trying to sort of protect her and separate her from the difficult relationships and things that have come previously. But they devised something called the Kensington system, which was actually really quite unpleasant for her.
It was. Victoria had a very retrospective ideas about her childhood. There's a book that Professor Kate Williams wrote called Becoming Queen, and it goes into Princess Charlotte, and it also goes into Queen Victoria's early childhood. And Victoria always paints this idea of this kind of lonely child shut up in Kensington Palace with no company and no other children to play with, and I'm very lonely, and it's actually not true. When Victoria's mother and the Duke of Kent came to Kensington Palace, or came to the UK in the very beginning from Germany, Victoria brought her two older children with her. So there was Charles, which was the older child, and there's also Theodora. So Victoria did have that company up until she was about 11 years old.
Right.
And there was also, John Conroy also had daughters as well, which Victoria was allowed to play with. So this kind of idea that she was always on her own and that it was a very kind of sterile and austere environment is not, that's how Victoria remembers it.
Yeah.
And that's how she writes it in her diary, but it's not really true. And there are instances of every birthday, Princess Victoria's mother would write her little notes, and she would leave them on her pillow. And when you see these notes written in books and stuff, they're actually very affectionate and very loving, but that's not how Victoria remembers it. Victoria remembers it as being very like sterile and oppressive and lonely and all these kinds of things. And that's the kind of insight into Victoria's character that she kind of only remembers.
Yeah.
She wants to.
So do you think, because obviously there was the Kensington system, which was this really oppressive, you can't do this, you can't do that, she couldn't have her own bedchamber, she couldn't walk in certain places, and then she was taken on all these tours because they were quite sort of, you know, we've got to preserve the monarchy and you need to be visible, you
Yeah.
know, you need to go out and you need to do these things. And she'd been so protected, hadn't she, at Kensington, that she did see reality, which a lot of monarchs didn't actually.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the ordinary people did suffer during the Georgian period because, and so to her to sort of go on and trains in these travels and seeing all these things was quite unpleasant. But we're coming back to Conroy here, and I think maybe a lot of the sort of the thing seems to be that why she remembers her childhood like this is because she blames him for the oppressiveness that she felt, and then maybe that her mother should have stepped in and not allowed this to happen, and maybe her mum was a bit weak, maybe he should have stood up for her a bit more. But what happened at Ramsgate, which I think when she was unwell at Ramsgate, that sealed the deal, as it should do, in someone's mind, that this person is an untrustworthy nutter.
Well, she had, I think it was it diphtheria she had, or it might have been scarlet fever. She had a really debilitating illness in Ramsgate, and they were on holiday there, like you say, on kind of like on holiday, but kind of like, you know, visibility to the public. And Conroy was trying to force her to sign this regency agreement that she would make her mother regent, and by association then he would become the power behind that regency. And she absolutely, even in her bed, she absolutely refused point blank to sign the piece of paper. She batted it away. She would not do it. So you see this kind of still in some of her character, even though she's a young girl, she still has this sense of, you know, and I think there's resentment towards her mother.
Yeah.
Like you say, but also in the context of a 19th century woman, she would have expected that she would need a male to look after her and to not necessarily tell her what to do, but to give her good advice.
Yeah.
You know, she wouldn't, a female who was independent, who was looking after her own, you know, her own affairs would be a very rare thing. I mean, Mary Wollstonecraft in the previous century had, you know, written about the rights of women, and it was like, oh my God, like, you can't say that. That's outrageous. You know, you must have heat on your brain. So, you know, it's not unusual for a woman to defer to a man, but in Victoria's eyes, you're deferring to this man who is, in her mind, abusing her.
Yeah. And so I think as well that sort of sets the tone for a lot of the future relationships she makes, combined with the fact that early on, she's obviously 8 months old, she's not going to remember anything about her father. No. And we very much see the main relationship she has with men for the rest of her life, are with male figures. She doesn't really have any close relationships, does she, with any female figures? Not even her children, really.
Oh well, she's just the children are. She wrote a letter to Vicky when her eldest daughter Vicky, when she became you know, and when she went to Germany to get married, and the correspondence between Vicky and Victoria is really important, because it's one of the blocks of correspondence that Beatrice didn't get her hands on when Victoria died, so it's not censored.
Yeah, she said a lot of her mother's writings, didn't she?
Yeah, she did. And Queen Victoria asked Beatrice to do it, so it wasn't, you know, it wasn't Beatrice to go, oh no, you can't do that. She writes to Vicky saying that the first 2 years of her marriage were completely ruined by this occupation, and that's basically her saying, you know, the pregnancy ruined the first 2 years of my marriage, and that's how she's seen it. She suffered dreadfully in pregnancy. She was only a tiny little thing, and in labour, and she resented the time that the children took her away from Albert. And Albert was very devoted to his children as well, so he would spend a lot of time with them, and anything that took Albert away from Victoria was a bad thing as far as she was concerned.
And she had 9 children, didn't she? But one of them passed away, Alice, is that right?
Yeah, so Alice did have diphtheria. Alice was, she also went, I can't even pronounce the place where Alice went and got married. It's Hollistein, I think. She looked after her father in his final illness, and she was very into nursing.
Right.
And her children, the whole kind of household went down with diphtheria. And because Alice was a nurse, she was looking after them. Obviously, Dr. Diphtheria is a highly contagious disease. Please don't, get too close, whatever. And she actually hugged one of her children who was distraught with the diphtheria, and the child survived, but Alice died. So, and she also, Queen Victoria also predeceased Leopold, her youngest son. He was a haemophiliac, and he died. I think he was 30 odd when he died. So there was a couple of her children that actually died before her, which was really sad. But yeah, as far as the children were concerned, it's kind of like, I love you, but it's all on my terms.
Yeah. I love you have to, maybe a little bit.
Yeah. She talks about them. If you the leaves from Our Life in the Highlands, if you've ever get a chance to read that, she talks about them very affectionately, and the dear children did this and the dear children did that, and blah blah blah, and the little ones and all this kind of thing. So she talks about them in a very affectionate way. But there's a very famous letter that Albert wrote to her, saying, it's a real shame that you can't find any pleasure in your children.
Yeah, that is quite sad.
Yeah, and he said to her, having children does not consist of you ordering them about and scolding them all the time. And he says to her, it's very difficult to have a relationship with somebody when you're scolding them all the time, because the scolder feels bad, and the scolded, they feel bad as well, and so the relationship doesn't prosper.
Yeah.
So she had a very difficult, and they had a very difficult relationship with her and each other.
So once she becomes queen, Conroy knows his time is up, and she shuns her mother, which is quite sad.
Yes.
And never really builds that relationship up again, and we will come back to that. But so she becomes queen, and it's all very exciting, as it is.
Yay!
I don't know, but presumably. And then we see the first of these firm and very deep friendships that she made in the current Prime Minister, the Whig Prime Minister. So tell us about him.
So Lord Melbourne, or William Lamb, as his, to give him his birth name, if you like, is the Prime Minister at the time when Victoria ascends the throne. And he's a very charming man. He is, I don't want to say dandy, that's the wrong kind of expression, but he's very charming. He's very, he knows how to flatter Victoria.
Yes, yeah.
And this is kind of the route he goes down with her. But also he kind of takes her under his wing as well, because she's only 18. I think back to when I was 18, and I'm sure those anyone who's watching is like,
myself, let alone
you're still kind of getting to grips with tying your shoelaces, they were like, oh, here's a whole empire, look after that.
Yeah.
So it kind of takes her under his wing, becomes a private secretary, all this kind of thing, and she is absolutely devoted to him. And in that devotion, we kind of get this scandal called the Bedchamber Scandal.
Yeah.
In that, when Lord Melbourne, who is loses the vote in Parliament and then has to resign, and she is devastated, does not want to let Melbourne go at all, because he's been so instrumental to these first, these initial dealings that she's having when she's first monarch. And Peel comes in, and he says, you can't have all these Whig ladies in your retinue. You have to have at least one or two Tory ladies. And she refuses, point blank, no, I won't do it. And Peel is like, well, if you won't do it, then it looks like that, we're not on the same page. And he has to resign as well, and she gets Melbourne back. And this is all she's interested in, how to get Melbourne back. She's not operating in that kind of constitutional monarchical role. She just wants what she wants. And And although Melbourne obviously wants back into power, he knows she's kind of doing the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And his government doesn't last that long. Melbourne's kind of got problems as well. His wife ran off with Lord Byron.
As you do.
As you do, you know. And I believe he also had a child who had learning difficulties, or, you know, what would we call that now? I don't know. The child.
Quite a broad umbrella, isn't it? It's,
yeah, you know.
Difficult to say. I haven't sort of read much about that, but certainly there is a much better understanding now of conditions like dyslexia, dyspraxia, overall learning disabilities, autism, ADHD. And quite often these things come as a dual diagnosis, and back then there wouldn't have been anything that even came close to trying to understand what would have been going on in those types of situations. So it would have been very, very trying.
Yeah, so I think he's portrayed in some dramatic portrayals. He's played as quite a melancholy kind of character. I think Lord Melbourne enjoyed all the benefits of his office. Let's say that.
For which you can't blame him. For which you can't. No.
He was a flatterer, and I think he genuinely did like her.
Yeah.
But he kind of laid it on.
Yeah. But he very much protected her, didn't he?
Yeah.
In some ways, I think that wasn't the right thing to do, but I can also see why he did it. But there was a lot of unrest at the time, wasn't there, in the country? Yeah. And I don't know how much obviously as Prime Minister, and he's formed a government.
Yeah.
When it comes to like policy decisions, essentially a lot of it is down to him and so on. But as monarch, and obviously there's this sort of constitutional crisis, and the bedchamber crisis makes it sound a bit naughty, but it wasn't.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah, it does.
You know, maybe she didn't, and he thought he was doing the right thing, I'm sure, but she didn't maybe face up to some of those things.
Yeah.
Well, which she could have done, which wasn't her fault necessarily. No. She just kind of went with it. But as you say, this made him. They used to ride together and do all sorts of things.
He had rooms at the palace and everything.
Yeah, and so it was really this sort of figure that she'd been looking for.
Yeah.
And he was quite astute, and he managed to fill that role perfectly.
He did.
As you say, he did come back in, became the Prime Minister again. A couple of years later, it all goes horrendously pear-shaped.
Yeah.
She's very unhappy. But talk at this point says, right, okay, well, you need to be married now.
Yeah, you need to. But Leopold and Stockmar have always, and Victoria's mother have always got this in the background. This is like a constant running backdrop. You know, from the minute these two children are born, they are like,
waiting for it.
Yeah, Albert is Victoria, Queen Victoria, the Duchess of Kent. That's her nephew. So there's a to us it's like, oh yeah, but weird.
It's like, oh.
I think also the thing that kind of perpetuates this as well is that they have the Lady Flora Hastings scandal as well that she kind of creates, and that's to do with Conroy as well. Lady Flora Hastings was a lady in waiting, or a maid of honour, however you want to say it, to the Duchess of Kent, and Victoria didn't like her all that much. And at one point, Flora Hastings starts to present this kind of abdominal, what looks like a pregnancy. And Victoria insists that she thinks that Lady Flora Hastings is pregnant by Conroy. This is another actually grinding on Conroy. And she demands an examination of Lady Flora Hastings, an intimate examination.
Yeah, that's...
Which is not nice. It turns out Lady Flora Hastings is not pregnant. What she's actually got is a uterine tumour that's causing the swelling. And not long afterwards, Lady Hastings actually dies of this tumour. The Hastings family go berserk, and they will not let it go. at all. Like they're in Parliament, they're in the House of Lords, they're jumping up and down, and Victoria's reputation, swiftly on the heels of the bedchamber crisis, really takes a massive hit over this, because it's not hushed up, it's completely public. And that's when they kind of like, you know what, hen? I think we need to find you something else to do.
quickly.
Yeah, quickly.
Yeah, but even though there was a few possibilities routes to go down to maybe secure a husband, but this very much, as you say, was the one. And even she shunned her mother, and her mother was a big influence in this union with Albert.
Yeah,
because it was going to help them. She was 3/4 German, Victoria, and it was really going to help them secure, I can't remember, it's a really long, Saxe-Coburg.
Gotha.
That's it.
That's the one.
A bit longer than Windsor or Tudor.
Yeah, a bit long. Yeah, absolutely.
So they were and they were also looking at Europe was running the risk of becoming a little bit more Republican, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And they didn't want that. They really wanted to keep this as a monarchical structure.
Yeah.
So they need to get married, have lots of babies, marry those babies to other royal babies, and keep it going nicely.
There wasn't that many. The thing about why these princes and princesses end up marrying all these German princesses and princesses is that what we understand as Germany now was just a load of little states at the time, and it was a kind of hangover from the Holy Roman Empire. Like when that kind of went bump, all of these little states kind of fractured, and we had the Duke of this and the Duke of that, and they were all pretty poor. They didn't have a lot of cash. And then you've got Austria at the top, kind of, it's kind of wielding the sword, and because of a lot of Great Britain was a lot of Europe was Catholic, still Roman Catholics, and the British royal family, because of the rules around the monarch not having a Catholic spouse, they couldn't marry into any of those houses, so they had to marry into the German princelings. So this is another reason why Albert is put forward, because Albert is a kind of like, he's not a Lutheran by any stretch of the imagination, but he is definitely a Protestant. So that's another tick in the box. You've got King Leopold, who's now the King of the Belgians, who's also a brother to Albert's father and to Victoria's mother. He's in the mix here. He wants this.
Yeah.
And Baron Stockmar, who has been in London and England for a long time, he wants this as well. And they see this as kind of like a way to stabilise Europe, but also their plan in their heads is also to have this united federal Germany.
Yeah.
Stop this business with the little states everywhere and to bring it all back together. And they see England and Great Britain as a way to do that.
Yeah.
So it's another reason. There are lots of reasons, but basically they want to be in charge.
Yeah, which is fairly standard. So Victoria had briefly met Albert and his brother previously.
Yeah.
His brother was the kind of tall, handsome, charismatic one. Yeah. But this idea was sort of proffered as him as a husband. Yeah. And I've heard her decision to marry him described as hormonal. She met him and she was just, even though it probably wasn't her decision, but she thought it was, which was what was important. Immediately smitten with him. She found him extremely attractive, and sort of charismatic and smart, and ticked all the
he didn't tick all the boxes. Some of the boxes were like
I think maybe it was hormonal then. But she was very taken with him.
Yes. Oh yeah.
She.
Well, the first time she met him, she was a bit kind of like, it's okay, but
whatever.
The second time she meets him, that she goes, oh, the eyes and the hair, and he's so tall. And
I wonder if there was an element of that she was looking for somebody, and maybe she just had this drilled into her so much that this is what should happen, that she was wanting to really, really completely be into this person. And then when he was actually quite handsome and charming and intelligent and everything like that, she thought, oh, good times.
I don't think he was particularly charming. And he's not particularly tall either. He's only 5'10". But when you see him next to Victoria, who's only kind of like 4'11", he looks enormous.
Yeah.
But when you see his actual his field marshal wedding clothes at Kensington Palace, you actually go, really? Are those the real clothes? But he's only 5'10". He's not that tall. He didn't really like dancing. He would not stay up late at night at all. By like 10 o'clock, he would be falling asleep. That was one of the things when they first met that she didn't like, because at 10 o'clock, Albert was like, bedtime.
Yeah.
You know, and when he was at university, you know, he had set himself this enormous task, you know, of study, and he would get up religiously at 6 o'clock in the morning to start. Wow. And that was him till like 7 o'clock at night. He would just study. So he was a very serious academic person. When he was 10 years old, he wrote in his diary, "I intend to train myself to be a good and useful man." And he kept, so he wasn't particularly charming with other women. Victoria, whenever he would meet a woman that he liked or would get on with, Victoria was completely taken aback, because he never really gravitated towards women at all. He's a very kind of serious man, but it's a bit of a dichotomy. He was a very serious man, but he's also described that with his family, he could be quite absurd and see the really ridiculous and funny side of things.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of horseplay with his children, and he didn't mind like the kind of being like self-deprecating and stuff like that with his children. But to the outside world, he was a very serious kind of, you know, not austere, maybe the wrong word, very serious and academic man. But she was prepared to put all of that aside because he had blue eyes.
Doesn't sound like me when I was at university.
So, no, he wasn't like, Ernest was like, yay, let's go. No.
So obviously, she proposes to him, in fact,
yeah.
And they marry, and they spend a lot of time immediately in Scotland.
Yes.
Now, when they marry, she promises to love, honour and obey.
Yeah.
Which I think he was like, yeah. He was like,
I'm not doing it.
I'm not doing it. It's all like, we're on, you know, everyone's watching. What can you do?
Yeah.
So there was a little bit of a clash here. And
yeah.
It was one of those relationships that was very passionate in both respects. There appears to have been a very big physical attraction, which is often missing in arranged marriages and these sort of royal matches. And they would have, you know, when they did have a bit of time to do things together, they really enjoyed them. I mean, she was ridiculously in love with him, like it was almost obsessional.
Yes.
So, but she wasn't, and he wanted to be king, really. You know, if you think about like William and Mary was the heiress, but William did become king. So I don't know whether or not he was kind of hoping that this would go down the same route, especially with that suspiciously close familial collection.
Bonds.
Yes. So it went very much one way. It was either extremely loving and passionate and all encapsulating this couple, or it got quite heated because she was like, well, yeah, you're my husband, but I'm the queen. So you're kind of here to help me. Great, good, you know, great, that's fantastic, but you're here to help me.
Yeah.
And then this is also possibly why she was a little bit resentful of her children, because she got pregnant pretty much straight away, didn't she, with Vicky?
Oh, yeah, bang. I mean, they were married in the February, and Vicky was born in November.
Yeah.
They called her, she was known to her family as Pussy.
Yes, there was no mucking about. And but of course, once she became pregnant, and she had, like, as we said, 9 babies, there was a lot of time being pregnant, a lot of time spent, unfortunately, with postnatal depression, a lot of time being exhausted with this situation. And so as that happened, unintentionally, she was almost forced to relinquish some of what she had seen as her roles and decision making and work over to Albert. So as the family grew, he became more and more sort of running the show, and almost was king, really.
Oh, he was in all but name. I mean, when he first arrives, you know, he's not a popular person. He's not a popular consort at all. He's not a popular choice. When Victoria, when they first get married, Victoria is actually, when she gets married, she says, "I want to be married as a woman. I don't want to be married as a queen." So she's like, she doesn't like it that it's all kind of all singing, all dancing, this kind of big state affair. And then she won't, absolutely refuses him to give him the key to any of the red boxes. She won't give him. So you can imagine for a man like Albert, who's very serious and very clever, and is able to sit there and just help her blot her letters, is really frustrating. And it's kind of a bit, if you hear Prince Philip is quoted as saying, I'm just the bloody amoeba. Kind of the same.
It was considered quite emasculating, wasn't it?
Yeah, the same thing. When Victoria first becomes pregnant, and obviously in those days, and they're going back to the experience of Princess Charlotte who died in childbirth, they're thinking there's a real chance that, number one, you might not survive this birth, the child might not survive the birth, you might perish and the child might live. So we're talking regency here.
Yeah. And
they have to fight tooth and nail to enable Albert to be named as being to act as regent for any child that might survive should Victoria die in childbirth. So you're right in what you're saying, that when she does become pregnant and have Vicky and Princess Victoria, he has spent a lot of time going through these boxes and reading it, and she starts to kind of get the idea that this isn't a challenge. This person can actually help me. So although she's kind of forced to relinquish some of the authority,
she just sees the benefit of it.
She sees the benefit of it, and then she says, get me a wet nurse. I'm not a cow and all this kind of stuff. Not realizing that if you actually feed the children yourself, if you actually nurse the children yourself, Victoria, you won't keep getting pregnant all the time. Of course, that's
did very successfully. There was definitely no sort of hereditary issues like and heirs. Who's going to take over problems going on, was there?
No. So he does to all intents and purposes become king, and it's at one point, like I said, a lot later on in their marriage, she does write to him in a diary saying Albert is a terrible man of business. Not as in like he's bad at business, he's just always at business.
Right, okay. So what sounds possibly like to a lot of people as a criticism of his ability isn't. It's actually the fact that he's so it's all encompassing to him.
Yeah.
And as you said earlier, anything that she understood that there were state duties and there were times when they were doing things together, but anything that took too much of his time, she didn't like. And so now going back to what you said about him not being very popular initially, and also not having the role that he wanted to initially.
Yeah.
He wanted to find a different way to kind of make his mark. And he was known very much for his architecture, wasn't he?
Yeah, absolutely.
The first place he acquired was the plot at Osborne on the Isle of Wight. Now, you love Osborne, don't you?
I love Osborne. I love Osborne. It's just a delight. It was next door to Tennyson. Lord Tennyson was their neighbour on the Isle of Wight.
Wow.
And there was a lot of wrangling. There was a house already on the Isle of Wight, and Queen Victoria had gone there when she was a child, so she did like the Isle of Wight, and Albert seen it as a place where they could really retreat as a family away from the whole London hustle and bustle and state affairs and stuff. But the woman who owned the house was absolutely playing hardball over the price.
As you can in that position.
As you can.
Yeah.
But what enabled them to actually buy the plots at Osborne was the sale of Brighton Pavilion, the Royal Pavilion at Brighton.
Oh, okay.
Because Victoria had stayed there just when she had gone there to visit, and then she had gone there when she had married and she had 2 children, but it wasn't big enough. She couldn't see the sea. She was a bit like, it's supposed to be a seaside pavilion. I can't see the sea. This is kind of
no. It is a little bit in, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a little bit in. And for those of you who've ever been to Brighton Pavilion, downstairs is very George IV, very gaudy, very elaborate. How he got away with it, I'll never know. But so they decided that they would sell the pavilion.
Yeah.
So that's why they stripped it bare. They took all of the stuff that belonged to the royal collection out, and they sold the pavilion, and that's what gave them the money in order to buy Osborne, and this woman who owned the house was playing hardball. And yeah, it's a gorgeous, gorgeous place. If any of you get the chance and you've never been there, and if
I
you,
was a child when I went, but I would love to go back now.
yeah,
Just another
I
trip
was.
to the Isle of Wight, to be fair, would be nice too. So, what other architecture is he known for? You mentioned a couple before we came in, but Alexandra Palace as well. Was that him?
He is. If you've ever been in London, where his monument is, where his memorial is,
Mm.
his memorial is just down the way from, or it's a little bit in front of where the Crystal Palace would have been, and that was the venue for the Great Exhibition in 1851.
Right, okay, that's where I've had that from in my brain then.
Yeah, and across the road is what is known as Albertopolis. So, like the Royal School of Music and the Royal Albert Hall and the V&A and all of those, and the science, I think it's the Science Museum or Science University, don't quote me, is all on that plot.
Oh, I still want to go back to London.
Yeah, no, me too. And that plot was actually paid for by the proceeds of the Great Exhibition at the Crystal Palace.
Wow.
Because Prince Albert actually, he took all of that money and he put it in a trust. So number one, it paid for the plots. But I think what a lot of people don't realise is that that trust fund still exists.
Wow.
And the people who attend those academic facilities actually benefit still from that trust fund and from the money that was generated, which is just incredible that is still, they had the foresight to take the money and not just kind of blow it on some, what George the Fourth would have done.
Generally what had happened with previous ones. Oh, I've got some money, let's either build something ridiculous or go to war with France.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Where's my ship?
Yeah, if in doubt, go to war with France. It's always the way forward.
So we're very much still benefiting from a lot of Prince Albert's endeavours. He was one of the first people to give a public speech against slavery. That was the first speech that he ever made, was to do with slavery. He also intervened he didn't intervene in the American Civil War, but the last piece of correspondence that he ever wrote before he took to his bed was about the American Civil War, and it was basically to do with two American Confederates who were on a British ship, and there was a bit of this almost dragged the UK into the American Civil War, but because Prince Albert and President Lincoln were able to communicate via telegram and stuff, they actually were able to come to a deal that stopped Britain coming to the Confederate aid. So, there's a lot of things, and sorry, I think we've gone off on a tangent about Prince Albert here.
This is why it's interesting, because like with a lot of monarchs, so because this is, I'm Tudory, or not just Tudory, but you go back to Henry VIII, for example, and obviously there hadn't been any sort of female rulers up to that point, but it's all very much about the monarch, and it's only more recent years that people have started looking at his wives very specifically and saying, well, hang on, they weren't just these women that died and got murdered. They actually had their own personalities and what actually happened to them. Catherine Howard wasn't just a silly little strumpet, and Anne Boleyn wasn't some, home-wrecking witch. And I suppose it's the same for Albert in a sense. Victoria is this quite opposing figure, isn't she?
Yeah.
And it's such a big part. And because that history is a little bit more recent as well, we still see more remnants of it. Lots of people live in Victorian terrace houses, for example. And things like that, and it just seems a little bit more real, but still, in the grand scheme of things, obviously, Victoria had continued in her reign for a long time after Albert passed away. But that we miss a lot of the things he did in his comparatively short time. As this role of a consort. It's still a consort when it's the male, isn't it? I always think.
Yeah. She had to. That's the other thing. She had to fight tooth and nail to get him that official title of Prince Consort. That was one of the things. She wanted him to have the title of king, but they were just no. That was completely off the table when the negotiations were on for his allowance when they were getting married. But eventually, she does get him this title.
So just to shoot ahead very briefly. the current Queen, Her Majesty
Yeah.
Elizabeth II, Prince Philip is obviously, he does tend to be known as Prince Philip still. Is he consort?
Yes.
He is, okay. Poor
He
chap.
is a consort. He is a consort, but he's the Duke of Edinburgh. So there was the day of the wedding, in November 1947. King George VI issued letters patent, making Philip Mountbatten,
Yes.
well, Lieutenant Mountbatten, making him the Duke of Edinburgh, His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh. And then later on in the 60s, Queen Elizabeth actually grants letters patent, making him Prince Philip.
Right, okay. I'm there.
So, yeah, because in actual fact, in technicality, Prince Charles actually held a higher rank than his father.
Oh dear.
And well, for those of us who kind of have any knowledge about Prince Philip, that's not going to be a situation I like to continue.
There's a documentary series that's only a few years old. I think it's called The Windsors, isn't it?
Mm.
And I don't know, it was on Netflix at one stage. I don't know if it's possible to find it now, but that does, in the early part of it, speak very much about how it was difficult, because Elizabeth wasn't expected to become queen as early as she did.
No.
He was at this height of this immense naval career, and
Yes.
he basically, the whole thing, he just had to wave it all goodbye.
Yep.
Which he did with probably about as much good grace as you can muster in these circumstances. So yeah,
there's a lot of correlation between the two men, between Prince Philip and Prince Albert. This kind of like Johnny Foreigner kind of thing, and not very popular, and and a bit kind of not anti-establishment, but I'm the king. I'm the consort of the husband, and you don't tell me what to do. I'm not here to be in your gang.
Yeah.
And I'm not here to fluff up your ego. Like, see this bird here.
That's that bird here. That's my
bird. She's my bird. She's the one in charge, and if you want to take me on, you're going to take her on too.
Yeah. Which is a pretty good way of like getting through life. But yeah, it's difficult. It is, even nowadays, it can be seen for a man of high ranking, or however you want to describe it, to be in the shadow of a woman.
Yeah.
And of course, the further you go back in history, or certainly after the arrival of Christianity, it very much was the case that a woman was subordinate. And then you see, really drifting now, but Queen Stephen and Matilda with the anarchy.
Yeah.
He wasn't very popular or whatever, but she was a woman. That was it. It didn't matter how awful he was. He could be the worst person ever to some people.
Yeah. And like you say, like how we don't live in isolation, the whole situation with Matilda made its way to Henry VIII's reign when he didn't have a son. And it was like, and Catherine of Aragon is clearly saying, well, our daughter Mary can be queen.
My mother's a queen.
My mother's a queen. I've acted as regent. It'll be fine. And Henry VIII was like, we've only had one queen, and it was a disaster, and it's just not happening. And that was the example, wasn't it? It was Matilda.
And the cool thing was that it wasn't her fault that it was a disaster. She wasn't really given the opportunity.
Yeah.
But it was just... Anyway, I've gone forwards and backwards now.
I know. But it's all like...
Bring us back to the 19th century.
Yeah.
So, you get this sort of real dual look. Oh no, that's not the word I'm looking for. But people look at their relationship in very different ways. So you've kind of got one camp of people who see it as this immense love story.
Yeah.
And then you've also got the people who say, no, it was fraught with difficulty. They argued constantly, vicious arguments, which in part obviously were due to the balance of power and unfortunate difficulties with their postnatal depression, which may not have been massively realised at the time, again, today, but almost felt that like he was exploiting her, and she knew that she could be difficult and hormonal and was feeling a bit full of the children. And so she would shout at him, but then she would feel sorrow. And it was almost like she put him on a pedestal and made herself be this really, really awful person. So where was it? Was it this really manipulative relationship, or was it actually like love's young dream?
I think the explanation that probably puts it best into context for me is she loved him on a deeply, deeply emotional, just emotions were out there at a deeply, deeply emotional level. And he did love her on an emotional level, but it was much more a sense of duty. But you've also got to remember that Albert's own childhood is a story of scandal as well, and it's not dissimilar to the kind of Diana, Princess of Wales story. Princess Louise, who was Albert's mother, was a very, very glamorous, charismatic young woman, and everybody loved her. You know, she could do no wrong. She had a much older spouse who wasn't that popular with his people, who was a bit of a philanderer. Yeah. You know, there was that huge kind of contextual double standard going on where he could have affairs but she couldn't.
Yeah.
She died. She was ostracized, eventually divorced. She died in Paris, a very young woman. So there's a lot of correlation between the kind of Princess Diana and Diana, Princess of Wales and Princess Louise. So this happened when Albert was 4. He never seen his mother again.
That's really sad.
That's really sad. You can understand why he has this deep set desire with Victoria to be this model family, where, you know, he doesn't go out drinking. He's not interested in any of that. He's only interested in being with Victoria, being with his children. And he, in my estimation, what he does in the relationship for Victoria is always in her best interest.
Yeah.
She is this emotional, she's emotional anyway. And then clearly we have this extra layer of these continual, exhausting, difficult pregnancies for this, you know, tiny little thing with no pain relief. You know, she says to the doctor before she gets pregnant with the last one, with Prince Beatrice, she says to Dr. Jenner, if I have to have another baby, I will die.
Oh, God.
So she is clearly, you know, on the emotional edge all the time. But they do rule together. It is I suppose it's a codependency.
Yes, yeah.
Very much a codependency, and you know, and she'll kind of have these massive, like, vicious, fly off the handle, you know, rows, and he's, no, I will come back to you when you've calmed down.
Yeah.
And he'll just leave the room. And, you know, for a lot of people, that kind of dismissal will make you even more, yeah, like, hysterical.
That's fine, just walk out.
Yeah. So, and then this is when we get, you know, he'll write her the letters. This is where the letter comes, you know, about he can't take the, you know, pleasure out of your children. And he writes her notes on how she can improve. And then she calms down, she becomes very contrite and very apologetic.
Yeah.
You know, I'm so sorry, you know, and you know, they've got a private lock on the inside of their bedroom door.
That was quite unusual as well, wasn't it then? Yeah.
You know, because people keep bursting in. And, you know, Albert and Victoria are not averse to a little bit of afternoon delight.
Afternoon delight.
So they
never heard it described as that before.
So they lock the door from the inside.
I don't
so that servants can't burst in. I mean, in royalty it would be like, maybe, you know, like kings and queens would have different bedrooms.
Yes.
As you know, and it would be like the king would, you know, get himself together and he would visit his wife, you know, however many times he should visit his wife, and that was it. But once you'd done your duty, you know, game over. You would go off, if you were a king, you would go off and entertain yourself elsewhere while your wife was doing what she was, you know.
Wife type things.
What was it? Anne Boleyn said it, where my belly is busy doing it. Where my belly is doing its business.
Right, yeah. Oh, she didn't have the best of husbands. But anyway, we're moving.
Oh, yeah.
That's a whole other story.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other thing.
Yes. So yeah, I think, and it is perfectly possible for a relationship to be at different ends of the spectrum. It's not uncommon at all. So, and then it's, again, it sounds a little bit like they were chalk and cheese in many respects, whilst they were often on the same page, because he was very sort of calm and steadied and often quite rational and thinking ahead, and she was just a bit like crazy, 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 angry, cross, very sad. Oh God, I'm really sorry. Oh, lock the inside of the door. Right, okay. So yeah, but it was in many ways a beautiful relationship, and they did have a lot of children. They had lots of children, and he was, as you say, he was a very attentive father, which wasn't often the case. It's not to say that all fathers of that period just couldn't be bothered with their children or didn't care about them, but especially, I was going to say, in the higher echelons of society, but I suppose that role was taken away, but it could be taken away from the mothers as well. You know, you don't necessarily, it's probably only really, even in our living memory, even though we're only 21, that you know, the mothers have started to kind of be a little bit more open with their affection towards their children. You know, you only really perhaps see that in the later half of the current Queen's reign, and we're coming back to Diana again, you know, whether people a lot appreciated her or they didn't, you definitely see this turning point with the outs, you know, we don't know what goes behind closed doors, but that sort of outward affection. So for him particularly, I think, to make time to have that relationship with his children says an awful lot about him, and it must have been a beautiful experience for them, because they must have seen to an extent how situations were with other families. They must have loved having him.
I mean, the interesting thing is he was very, very close to Vicky, very, very close to Vicky. Vicky was very like him, and Bertie, Albert Edward, was very like Victoria.
Okay.
This is a huge problem for Victoria, because Victoria wants Bertie to be in the image of Albert. And Bertie is just never, ever. Vicky's very clever. She's just naturally very clever. She's very like her father. She's very studious. She's very smart. And Bertie's always academically being compared to Vicky.
Right, okay.
And he's never going to get there because he just doesn't have it. His skills are just in different areas. But this drives Victoria mad. And particularly when Albert dies, it drives her mad. Because she's Bertie's a Hanoverian, you know. He's not a Coburg, he's a Hanoverian, and he is going and doing all the Hanoverian excesses, you know, with, you know, Nellie Clifton and all of that carry on that happened. And
very sociable.
Yes, I mean, he wasn't called Edward the Caresser for nothing. So he's doing all of these things, and you know, Queen Victoria finds that very, and he even looks like Victoria, and that's exactly the opposite from what she wants. But they make, I think, if there's a criticism that I would have of them as parents, they make huge mistakes with Bertie and the education of some of the other boys as well, because there is this expectation that they will be, you know, this part of this model family, and they will be moral, and they will behave, and there won't be excesses in drink, and, you know, Victoria can't abide smoking, and you know, Bertie wants to have, after Albert's death and Bertie's grown up, he wants to have the smoking room opened at Balmoral, and she just won't wear it, it's disgusting, and she wants it closed, and all this kind of thing. So they really made some serious mistakes on his education. Like, they thought that having given them this huge kind of scholarly timetable would make it better.
Doesn't work like that.
It didn't work like that, you know, because Bertie's got Queen Victoria's personality, so he just like flips his lid and goes mad. And his father's like, you have to be disciplined, you know, you're not just, you know, a normal person, you're going to be the king and you have to behave. And Victoria's kind of like, you have to, if you are the king like your father is, then everything will be hunky-dory. It's huge amounts of expectation.
And that's sort of not a nice thing for a young man to hear, is you need to be more like your father. It's that constant, you're not good enough, isn't it? And that really doesn't help. The irony of that, of course, being that it makes them even more the opposite to what they are required to be.
What they're required to be. I mean, even when they're naming the children, I mean, every single one of them has got Albert and Victoria in their name,
Well,
but it's very clear. Victoria makes it very clear that when Bertie succeeds to the throne, he will not be King Albert, because there can only be one Albert.
oh goodness.
And it can't be, there can't be, so that's why he's Edward VII.
So obviously we come to the point where, was it 1861?
1861 he dies.
So, but first of all, earlier in the year, her mother passes away.
Yeah.
And despite this kind of insistence, even internally, that they'd had this sort of rubbish relationship and she wasn't cared for, etc., etc., it actually hits her extremely hard, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, because she's actually, Albert helps her to reconcile with her mother.
Yeah.
They have a much closer relationship at the end of the Duchess of Kent's life than they had when Victoria was a child, and maybe it's partly to do with Victoria becoming a parent and maybe understanding a bit more, having that empathy of, you know, this is maybe why.
Yeah.
And plus the fact, you know, Albert is the Duchess of Kent's nephew, so he's got a familiar relationship with her as well, and he kind of brings them together. And she's devastated when the Duchess of Kent dies. She goes, it's almost like at the point that nervous collapse.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's why Albert has to take on a lot of the extra responsibilities. And Victoria's physical health, even though she had these 9 pregnancies, was always really robust. She always had really robust physical health.
Yeah.
He has like emotional health, if you like, but he doesn't have physical health. He's often quite ill.
Yeah.
And having to, you know, cope with Victoria having, you know, this nervous collapse and take on her responsibilities as head of state affects his own health.
Yeah. And unfortunately, at the end of the same year, he also passes away.
He does. Nursed by, she won't, Victoria blames Bertie for Albert's death because Albert goes and Bertie gets into this scandal and with Nellie Clifton and one thing and another, and being named in divorce petitions, and Albert's basically trying to say to goes to Cambridge to visit Bertie, and they get into this long walk in the rain when they get lost, and Albert's basically saying that this woman could turn up in court with your child, and this could be this is a disaster. Like, you don't seem to realise the forces that you're meddling with. So they have this big conversation. He makes his way back to Windsor. He gets involved in this this business with the American Civil War, and he takes to his bed. But Victoria refuses to call Bertie to the bedside to begin with, because she says, I can't look at the boy, because he's caught this emotional turmoil he's putting us through is the reason why his father is, you know, as ill as he is. But eventually, I think Alice, who is Bertie's kind of favourite sister, and she's nursing her father, gets in touch with him, and he comes to the bedside, but Victoria just can't even look at him.
So we were talking before we came on a little bit about, as I said, I can actually imagine that being Victoria's reaction, because she was so utterly absorbed by him from the moment that she met him. And then, of course, obviously things change and things happen, and, you know, but to lose him for her was just inconceivable.
Yeah,
and
totally.
She would have, and then we all, to an extent, can be irrational when we're experiencing extreme emotions, grief being one of them. And I can imagine her needing to find somebody or something to apportion the blame to help it make sense.
Yeah. I mean, she sends him on a tour of trying to think. I can't exactly remember where he is, but she sends him on a I think it might be the Far East. She sends him on a tour because she can't bear to look at him.
Yeah.
And she you know, she writes in her diary, you know, on Albert's death, you know, the world for me as a happy place has ended.
Yeah.
And you know, she said, I will continue, I will try, and I will continue for the dear children, but she's hoping, if you read her diary extracts, which has now been digitised, she's hoping to die. That's the kind of extremity that she's in. She can't think of anything else other than, and she becomes fascinated with death.
Yes.
After this, fascinated. When people died, she wants every detail. You know, she wants to know how they died, what they died of, what time, and what medicines they had, and what doctor they were attended by, and all the details of the funeral. And people around about her find it, you know, quite kind of macabre and morose. They're like, all these details, but she becomes fascinated with death. Oh goodness!
Because didn't she like every year sort of make the children dress in mourning and drag into the room in which he died?
Yeah.
They were starting to get really quite resentful, I think, of that, weren't they? They didn't want...
The room that Albert dies in at Windsor is called the Blue Room, and he was moved in there, I think, maybe 7 days before, a good time before he actually did pass away. But the Blue Room is actually where William IV, and William IV, and William George IV, and all that.
They're all, no, we've had nearly every person I've spoken to has said, why have these people got such confusing names?
That was the Blue Room, is where both of those kings had died.
Oh, okay.
And every 14th of December, she would assemble the children, and she would have this kind of like ritual where they all went through. It's amazing actually that the date of Albert's death keeps reoccurring. When later on in life, Prince Bertie becomes really ill with typhoid fever, which is what they thought had killed his father. And he's at Sandringham and he's very ill, and it's touch and go. Princess Alexandra, the Prince of Wales, is with him. And it's the only time Victoria ever goes to Sandringham. It's the only time she had been up until that point. But she goes, and the crisis point comes for Bertie of whether he's kind of live or die. It comes on the 14th of December.
Wow.
Because they're all approaching this date thinking this can't possibly happen again. And Princess Alice, who died of diphtheria, she actually dies on the 14th of December as well.
Oh my goodness.
So it keeps on. And for Victoria, this is obviously a huge, thing.
Oh, wow. It's quite terrifying.
I don't know.
When you look at those starts coincidences, it's the way you actually literally start to get something in your head that's going to be the case.
That's going to happen. So
we've got to wrap up a little bit now. Obviously, if people want to hear about Victoria's life after Albert, we can always come back and do it again.
I get excited back on Prince Albert. Oh.
I always find a way to sneak these things in. But so just as a brief summary though, of really how Victoria, for the best part, conducted her life and herself after Albert passed away, those 40 odd years in which she lived without him, and therefore to her alone sometimes she had like male friends, but we can definitely talk about them another time because they're an interesting bunch. She was never really the same, was she?
She was never the same person after Albert's death. She did work incredibly hard in private. She still had all the state boxes and she still worked. For the first 10 years of her seclusion, it was really the public appearances that filled her with dread. But in some cases, and some biographers actually make the case that after Albert died, because she did see him as kind of like my father, my mother, my friend, my husband, she had to then develop a way and a personality that enabled her to carry on the affairs of state, albeit from a distance. I mean, we're talking earlier on about how Gladstone had to wheedle her into opening Blackfriars Bridge. It was like, you will do this.
I will not.
I will not. And her doctor, Dr. Jenner, who's not, talked about in glowing terms, would kind of acquiesce to her when she would say, oh, my nerves, I can't do it, instead of going, well, you really are, okay. How I kind of read it is that she did start to come to terms with the grief, but at some point she couldn't live without it. It became part of her personality.
That does make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and that she couldn't quite let it go, even though the natural process would have allowed her to have opened up a little bit more. She's still seen a prime minister. She still appointed dignitaries and foreign ambassadors and all these different things.
Yeah.
She engaged in an enormous amount of correspondence with Vicky, thank goodness, and all of her children. And then when she did die, she gave instructions to her youngest child, Beatrice, who kind of acted as her private secretary, to censor and destroy a lot of the diaries. I know, to much of the charging of
for us now, it's exceptionally frustrating. But they did still, even with areas that got missed, either accidentally or otherwise, and even with the censorship that there was, they've still provided an absolutely incredible insight into not just her, but the psychology of other people at the time, and the relationships made and how relationships were forged, and the political system, and even just from an observational point of view, she would have made observations that she noted about things that were sort of incidental, but it still gives us a really lovely rounded view of what was happening in her lengthy and very
tumultuous.
Tumultuous, that's a good word.
Tumultuous. Yeah, she did. I think she was taught, Albert taught her one thing, it was how to be the constitutional monarch.
Yeah.
And how to, like our Queen Elizabeth now, albeit, last year when, our current Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson, said we're going to prorogue Parliament, and we all kind of threw our hands up in the air and went, you can't do that! You can't do that, please, as our sovereign, tell him no! Whatever your political thoughts might be. She had to acquiesce to what her government, her Prime Minister, First Lord of the Treasury, had told her to do. And Queen Victoria was, taught by Albert, or encouraged by Albert, to put her own personal feelings aside and do the right thing constitutionally. And she carried that through her whole reign. Although I'm sure in the background she might have gnashed her teeth to win an inch of her gums, she did. That's how she operated.
I think the bedchamber crisis, just very quickly, that was really the point at which maybe she had to realise that she couldn't just go, well, I don't want it that way, I want it that way.
Yeah,
it was unconstitutional, and she just had to sort of suck it up and get on with it, really.
I mean, particularly when Palmerston, kind of going back a wee bit, and I know we've got to wrap up, with Palmerston, he was kind of gung-ho and would send a fire ship or a ship into battle without her permission, and that drove them both mental. But she still had to kind of sit back and watch him, do all these things, and it would drive her nuts. But she had to just maintain that. Aline Croquet is the Prime Minister, so I know we disagree with that, but we have to let him do it because, that's the way it is.
I'd love to know what some of the, what Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth has thought of some of our leaders in the past few years. Very diplomatic, unlike me.
Yes, it would be great to be a fly on the wall in those Tuesday night audiences when she advises and warns.
Yes. Thank you so much for today. It's an amazing story, an amazing relationship, and thanks to her diaries, we are given such a rare insight into everything. So good job she made them, really. And they are available. I think you just said that they were digitised.
Yeah, they are digitised. It was actually her mother gave her first journal when she was a young child, and said to her, you should write a journal or a diary of what your thoughts are and what you're doing. And she continued it her whole life, albeit that they were censored by Princess Beatrice. They are digitised. You can see a lot of them online. If I can find a link for it, I'll send it to you.
That would be great, and I can pop it underneath with any other bits and pieces as well when it goes up. So thank you very much for spending time with us today, and hopefully we have this plan to meet in York when we're all
York.
freedom. So hopefully it won't be too long before I see you at York.
Fingers crossed. Thank you so much for anyone who's watching, and thank you to Catherine.
They want to see me. They want to see you. They all know me. They've had enough of me now.
That could never happen. That's an oxymoron of a statement.
I can introduce you to quite a few people who would beg to differ. But anyway.
Anyway.
You take care, and I will definitely speak to you soon. See
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye.